Jungkook sat in the living room, his frustration evident as he tapped his phone, waiting for the call to connect. Why is he not picking up my calls? He muttered under his breath, annoyance creeping into his voice. He cut the call with a sharp sigh, tossing the phone onto the sofa beside him. Across the room, Wine quietly stood by the ironing board, pressing one of his shirts, her eyes briefly glancing at him, sensing the tension in the air. She remained silent, knowing it was best not to speak when he was in such a mood. On the opposite sofa, Mrs. John Chunguk's mother sat elegantly, watching her son with a knowing look, her lips curled into a subtle smirk. She knew her son too well, knew how to play her cards when the time was right. What happened, my child? Mrs. Jones finally spoke, her tone sweet, almost soothing, but there was a sharpness behind her words, one that only one could sense from years of silent observation. Jungkook, ever dutiful to his mother, turned his attention to her. It's nothing, just some work issue. He replied, trying to hide the edge in his voice. Mrs. Jones tilted her head, a look of concern on her face. You seem so stressed, darling. Maybe it's time you took a step back from all these responsibilities, don't you think? Chunko frowned, but before he could respond, she continued, her voice soft and lovable. I have always told you that you need someone who can truly support you, someone who understands you the way I do. Her gaze briefly flickered toward Wine, a silent jab that didn't go unnoticed. Wine's hand stilled on the iron for a moment. She lowered her gaze, biting back the words that wanted to escape, knowing how pointless it was to argue. Jungkook had always been blind to his mother's manipulations, and no matter what Wine said or did, he would always take Mrs. Jones' side. Jungkook nodded slightly, almost as if he had no choice but to agree. You're right, mother, he said, his voice softer now. I will take care of it. You always know what's best. Mrs. Jones smiled, her eyes gleaming. That's my boy, she cooed, reaching out to gently pat his hand. Don't let anyone distract you from what really matters. Focus on the bigger picture. Wine silently swallowed her frustration. Her hands continuing to iron the shirt as if nothing had happened. She knew Mrs. Jones' words were a thinly veiled dig at her, and as always, Jungkook never questioned his mother's intentions. The tension in the room thickened, an unspoken battle between Mrs. Jones and Wine. One where Wine always seemed to be on the losing edge, as Jungkook got up abruptly from the sofa, frustration still evident on his face. He didn't say a word to his mother. His jaw clenched, and with quick strides he headed toward his room. But just as he reached the doorway, he turned slightly and called out, Wine, come here. His voice was cold, commanding, leaving no room for delay. Wine startled, quickly turned off the iron and placed it on the stand. Her hands fumbled for a second, but she hurriedly followed him. Mrs. June watched the scene unfold with a raised eyebrow and a subtle smirk. As soon as Wine disappeared into the room behind Jungkook, Mrs. Jones' gaze sharpened. With quiet precision, she stood from the sofa, making her way to the ironing board. Her fingers casually reached for the iron, and without hesitation, she pressed it onto the shirt. Wine had been carefully ironing moments earlier. The fabric sizzled as the iron left dark burn marks across the crisp material. Mrs. Jones smiled with quiet satisfaction, stepping back as if nothing had happened. Moments later, Jungkook, fresh from the shower, called out from the bathroom, "Wine, bring me a towel." His voice was distant, yet coldly authoritative. Wine, who had been waiting outside the door, rushed to grab a towel and passed it to him without a word. As Jungkook stepped out of the bathroom, drying his hair, a sharp, acrid smell filled the air. He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Something's burning," he muttered, his expression darkening. Mrs. Jones, who was sitting back in the living room, called out instantly, her voice laced with false concern. "Oh dear, Jungkook, I think something is burning in here. I just noticed it a few moments ago." Jungkook's frown deepened. He followed the smell, his sharp gaze landing on the ironing board. The shirt he had planned to wear lay there ruined with a large burn mark in the center. He picked it up, turning it in his hands, and his eyes darkened further. Without looking up, he spoke, his voice ice cold. "Wine." Wine, standing in the corner of the room, felt a chill run down her spine at the way he said her name. Her fingers instinctively clenched the edge of her dress as she slowly approached him. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Jungkook held up the burned shirt, his expression unreadable but terrifyingly calm. "What is this?" Wine's heart raced and she glanced at the shirt, then back at him, trying to find her words. I was ironing it, and then you called me, so I turned off the iron, and before she could finish, Mrs. Jones interjected smoothly from the other room, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Oh, Wine, you must have been careless. It's such a shame. Jungkook needed that shirt for an important meeting." Wine's eyes widened, her breath hitching in her throat. She knew the truth, but how could she explain it? Jungkook's cold gaze pinned her down, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Careless," he repeated, his voice low and controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "You had one simple task and you couldn't even handle that." His words cut deep and Wine swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to the floor. She wanted to explain, to defend herself, but the weight of Mrs. Jones' calculated manipulation hung over her like a shadow. I'm sorry," she finally stammered, knowing it wouldn't make a difference. Chunguk's cold indifference was like a wall she couldn't break through. "Sorry doesn't fix this," he said sharply. Throwing the rain shirt onto the sofa without another word, he turned away from her, his frustration palpable as he ran a hand through his wet hair. Mrs. Jones sat back with a satisfied smile, her eyes watching wine like a hawk. It's all right, my dear, she called out sweetly, though her tone was anything but kind. Everyone makes mistakes. After all, Wine clenched her hands tightly, her throat constricting with unshed tears. She felt trapped, knowing that no matter what she said or did, Mrs. Jones would always turn things against her. And Jungkook, he would always believe his mother. As Jungkook slipped on the fresh shirt that Wine had handed him, he could feel his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. The tension from earlier still lingered in the air as they made their way to the dining area where Mrs. Jones was meticulously setting the table for breakfast. Why are you letting my mother do all the work? Jungkook snapped, eyeing Wine with irritation. You should be the one taking care of things around here. I was about to help Jungkook. I didn't ask her to do anything. Wine defended herself, her voice trembling slightly. But Jungkook cut her off, his patience wearing thin. Enough with excuses. Just handle your responsibilities. Mrs. Jones spoke with innocence, looked up with wide eyes. Oh, Jungkook, sweetie, you don't need to be so harsh on her. Yesterday, Wine told me to prepare breakfast, and I thought it would help lighten her load. Wine's eyes widened in shock, her mouth opening to protest. Mom, I only asked you to turn off the stove. But Jungkook's cold gaze pinned her down. See, Wine, you need to be more organized. I won't tolerate this kind of disarray in my home. Mrs. Jones smirked subtly, her cleverness evident as she played the part of the concerned mother. I just want what's best for my son. It's important to maintain a smooth running household. Feeling the weight of the accusation, Wine's heart sank, but she stayed silent, knowing that any further protest would only fall on deaf ears. Breakfast proceeded in an awkward silence, punctuated by the clinking of cutlery against plates. Wine served Jungkook, her hands shaking slightly as she passed him the food. After they finished eating, Jungkook stood up, ready to leave for the office. He turned to leave, his voice low but firm. Listen, if my mother keeps doing all the work around here, it's going to be a problem. I won't tolerate any laziness. But I once started, but he raised a hand to silence her. I don't want to hear it. If my mother is resting in her room all day, it's not your excuse to do the same. With that, he walked out, leaving Wine feeling defeated as the door closed behind him. Mrs. Jones turned to Wine, a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. You really need to step up, dear. It's important to keep Jungkook happy. Wine nodded, feeling the weight of Mrs. Jones' words pressing down on her, knowing that in this household it was hard to find her place. After a long day filled with tension and uncertainty, Wine received a message that sent her heart racing. It was from Stephen, her childhood friend who had moved to America 12 years ago. Hey, Wine, it's been ages. I'm back in town and would love to catch up. Are you free? Wine's heart skipped a beat as she read the message. Wow, I can't believe it's been so long. She thought, excitement bubbling inside her. She quickly typed a reply. Stephen, yes, of course. I can't believe you are back. When do you want to meet? How about today? I'm staying at my parents' place. We could meet at the cafe we used to go to. Sounds perfect. I'll be there. Can't wait to see you. After confirming their plans, she turned to her phone and decided to call Jungkook. Her heart raced a little as she dialed his number. Hey Jungkook, she said, her voice tinged with eagerness. Stephen is back in town and he wants to meet. Can I go see him? Jungkook's voice was calm, but she could hear the underlying tension. Stephen, the one you used to talk about all the time. Yes, it's been 12 years since he moved. Wine replied, her excitement evident. I really want to catch up with him. Chunguk paused, then said, if you want to meet him, that's fine. Just make sure you are back home before dinner. Thank you, Wine exclaimed, relief washing over her. She felt a flicker of freedom, a chance to reconnect with someone from her past. As she got ready, the thought crossed her mind that she should probably inform Mrs. Jones about her plans. It would be best to keep her in the loop, especially after the previous misunderstandings. Wine made her way to Mrs. Jones' room and knocked softly on the door. Mrs. Jones, she called, but there was no response. With a slight hesitation, she opened the door and peeked inside. To her surprise, Mrs. Jones was sleeping peacefully, her face relaxed and serene. Wine felt a pang of guilt for waking her, but she knew she needed to inform her about Stephen's visit. Instead of waking her, Wine decided to leave a note. She quickly found a piece of paper and wrote, Dear Mrs. Jones, I hope you are having a good rest. I want to let you know that I'll be meeting my childhood friend Stephen today. He just came back from America after 12 years. I'll make sure to be home before dinner. She folded the note neatly and placed it on the bedside table where Mrs. Jones would see it when she woke up. Feeling a sense of accomplishment, Wine turned to leave, hopeful that everything would go smoothly. Once she was ready, she headed out to the cafe, her heart racing with anticipation. As she walked in, she spotted Stephen sitting at a table, looking just as she remembered him, his familiar smile bringing back a flood of memories. Stephen, she called out, waving enthusiastically. Wine, he stood up, grinning widely. They embraced tightly, both laughing with joy. It's been too long, you have not changed a bit. Stephen remarked, pulling back to look at her. Neither have you. It feels surreal to see you again. Wine replied, her eyes sparkling with excitement as they settled down to catch up. The conversation flowed effortlessly, reminiscing about their childhood adventures and sharing what had happened in their lives over the years. As Wine and Stephen settled into their conversation, the hours flew by filled with laughter and nostalgia. You remember the time we tried to build a tree house in your backyard? Stephen chuckled, his eyes shining with mirth. Of course, and it fell apart the moment we stepped inside. Wine laughed, recalling the memory vividly. Your dad was so mad at us. Stephen grinned. Yeah, he was, but he helped us build it again anyway. Those were good times. They really were. Wine sat, her heart swelling with warmth. I missed you so much while you were away. I missed you too, Stephen replied earnestly. It's great to finally see you again after all these years. As their conversation continued, Wine felt a sense of comfort and familiarity with Stephen, a reminder of her carefree days. But time slipped away faster than she realized. Finally, after hours of talking, Wine glanced at her watch. Oh no, I have to head back. Stephen stood up as well. Wait, let me walk you out. He sat, smiling warmly. As they reached the cafe's entrance, Stephen unexpectedly hugged her tightly. I'm really glad we reconnected. Why? Let's not wait another 12 years, okay? Definitely, she promised, her heart fluttering as they pulled away. They exchanged a few more goodbyes, and with one last wave, Wine headed home. Her mind buzzing with the day's events. When Wine entered the living room, she noticed Mrs. Jones sitting on the sofa, a book in her hands. The atmosphere felt tense, but she brushed it off. Welcome back, Wine, Mrs. Jones said, glancing up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Where have you been? Wine hesitated for a moment, then replied, I went to meet Stephen. I left you a note. Mrs. Jones' expression shifted slightly and she feigned ignorance. A note? I didn't see any note. Just then, Jungkook walked into the room, catching the tail end of their conversation. He raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. What's going on? He asked, looking between Wine and his mother. I was just asking Wine where was she? Mrs. Jones chimed in, her tone innocent. She claims she left a note, but I didn't say it. Wine felt her frustration boiling over. I wrote it for you, Mrs. Jones, she said, her voice steady but firm. I thought you would see it when you woke up. Mrs. Jones shrugged, pretending to be oblivious. Well, I didn't see it, so I had no idea you were out. Chungo crossed his arms, looking at wine with a phone. You should have told me before going out. What if something happened? I told you, Jungkook. Wine shot back, her anger rising. I left a note for her. Jungkook's gaze shifted to Mrs. June, who smiled sweetly, playing her part perfectly. Maybe you should be more responsible, Wine. It's important to keep your family informed. He said, his tone firm. Responsible? Wine exclaimed, her voice trembling with frustration. I'm tired of being treated like a child. I'm an adult and I deserve to be treated with respect. What are you talking about? Jungkook snapped, his voice cold. You are in my house. You should follow our rules. Our rules? Wine replied incredulously. You mean your mother's rules? I can't even step out without your permission. Mrs. June interjected, her tone sweet. It's just common courtesy, dear. We're family. Family? Whiny code, her heart racing with indignation. You think this is how family treats each other? By lying and manipulating. Jungkook's expression hardened. You should have communicated better. He said, crossing his arms defensively. Communicated better. Wine retorted, her voice rising. I wrote a note, but clearly that wasn't enough for you or your mother. You both just want to control me. In that moment, she felt a wave of determination. You know what? You have failed as a husband, she declared, her voice steady and defiant. Jungkook's eyes widened in disbelief. Why don't say that? You are being unreasonable. Unreasonable? Why shook her head? Her chest tightening. I'm tired of being catch in your family schemes. I'm done. With that, she stormed toward the door, grabbing her luggage from her room. Why in which? Jungkook called, panic creeping into his voice. You don't mean that? But why didn't stop? I'm done with this, she said, her heart racing. I deserve better than this toxic environment. You both make me feel like I don't belong here. You are overreacting, Jungkook shouted, desperation lacing his words. We can talk about this. Talk, you don't listen. Wine shouted back, tears welling up in her eyes. You only hear what your mother tells you. You never believe me. With that, she opened the door and walked out, leaving Jungkook and Mrs. Jones in stunned silence behind her. As she stepped into the hallway, she felt a mix of anger and relief. She had finally stood up for herself, but the weight of uncertainty hung heavy in the air. As Wine stepped out of the house, her heart pounded in her chest. Her eyes were filled with tears that she tried to blink away, but they slipped down her cheeks. Anyway, gripping the handle of her luggage tightly, she began pulling it along the path. Her vision blurred as the weight of everything that had just happened crashed down on her. Suddenly, the sky opened up and rain began to pour. The cold drops hit her skin. soaking her clothes almost instantly, but she didn't care. She felt numb, as though the storm outside mirrored the chaos in her heart. The world around her was a blur of wet streets and cold wind, but she barely noticed. She stumbled onto the road, her legs moving without direction, her thoughts racing. How did it come to this? She whispered to herself, her voice shaking. I gave everything, everything, and still he doesn't see me. He will never see me. Her grip on the suitcase tightened as she walked. Rain drenching her hair, making it stick to her face. Why didn't he believe me? Why does it always have to be her? Her voice was almost lost in the sound of the rain, but she kept talking to herself as if trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions. I tried so hard to be a good wife. It's been 3 years, but nothing's ever enough for him. Her chest heaved and she wiped at her eyes, though the tears mixed with the rain, making it impossible to tell which was which. Her feet splashed through puddles. But she was barely conscious of her surroundings. The world felt distant, like she was walking through a dream. Her thoughts continued to spin, each one heavier than the last. I'm done. I'm really done this time. She murmured, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. She had no idea where she was going, only that she couldn't stay there, in that house under the shadow of Mrs. Jones and the man who had failed her as a husband. The rain pelted down harder, drumming against the suitcase as she dragged it behind her. Her legs were growing tired, but she didn't stop. She couldn't, not yet. Maybe, maybe I was never enough. Her words were choked with emotion. Maybe I was just fooling myself, thinking he would choose me over her. For a moment, she paused, standing in the middle of the empty road, the rain pouring down around her. She looked up at the stormy sky, her face a mixture of tears and rain, her heart heavy with sorrow. Why can't he see that I just wanted his love? She whispered to the sky, her voice cracking. The cold wind whipped around her, but she didn't feel it. She was lost in the storm of her emotions, walking with no destination, no idea of what came next. As one continued walking in the rain, her thoughts spiraling, her phone buzzed in her pocket. The vibration was soft against her drenched clothes. Almost unnoticed in the chaos of her mind, she fumbled for it, her hands trembling as she pulled it out. It was Stephen. She hesitated for a moment, her thumb hovering over the screen before she finally swiped the answer. Hello. Her voice cracked, heavy with emotions. On the other end, Stephen instantly sensed something was wrong. His cheerful tone quickly vanished. Why? Are you okay? You sound off. Her breath hissed. She wiped her face, though it didn't stop the rain or the tears. I'm fine. She whispered, her voice barely audible over the downpour. Stephen's voice grew more serious. his concern evident. That doesn't sound like fine. What's going on? Where are you? I can barely hear you, she sniffed. Her grip on the phone tightening as the emotions she had been holding in began to overflow. I left, she admitted softly, her voice shaky. I couldn't take it anymore, Stephen. I had to get out. Left? What do you mean, left where? His voice grew more urgent, panic creeping in. Why? Where are you right now? Her gaze dropped to the ground as she kept walking aimlessly. Down the rain-soaked street? I don't know. I just walked out. I couldn't stay there. Stephen, he her voice cracked, the words catching in her throat. Stephen's voice sharpened. What did he do? Did Jungkook hurt you? His protective instinct kicked in, and the panic in his voice only grew. Wine shook her head. Though Stephen couldn't see it, not like that, but he doesn't believe me. He never believes me. It's always about her. His mother, I'm tired, Stephen. I'm so tired of fighting to be seen. Her words poured out like the rain, heavy with tears of pent up frustration and pain. Stephen's breath hissed on the other end, his worry intensifying. Wine, listen to me. Where are you? I will come get you right now. Just tell me where you are. She glanced around, trying to make sense of her surroundings through the blur of rain and tears. I am just walking. I don't even know where I'm going. Stephen cursed under his breath. Stay where you are. Just stop walking and tell me the street name or anything you can see. I will find you. But Wine wasn't thinking clearly. She continued moving forward, her feet dragging along as though she had a mind of her own. I don't want to bother you. I will be fine. Her voice was weak, unconvincing. Stephen's voice hardened with resolve. Wine, you are not fine. I can hear it in your voice. Don't you dare shut me out right now. Just tell me where you are. She finally slowed her steps, glancing around to find a street sign. Elm Street? I think I'm near the corner of Elm and Maple. Stephen didn't hesitate. Good. Stay there. Okay. I'm coming. Don't move. His tone left no room for argument, and the line went dead. Wine stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in her hand. She let out a shaky breath, her emotions still tangled as she realized she wasn't alone. Stephen was coming for her. The thought offered a silver of comfort amidst the storm of confusion and heartbreak she was in. As the rain continued to pour down, she found herself whispering again, this time with a faint glimmer of hope. Maybe, maybe things can change.